The UN brokered ceasefire in Syria is clearly not working, Patrick. How much is this due to that foreign involvement that some are claiming is coming from the Gulf states and other countries?
Well, I think it's important to just point out from the start that the UN broken peace deal is foreign involvement to start off with. This isn't a case of the Syrian people sitting down and negotiating by themselves. This is Kofi Annan and various officials coming in and imposing a peace plan and a treaty upon the Syrian people. So I mean, from the start, it's important to point out that foreign intervention is happening already in Syria.
But Patrick, don't you need a mediator between these two factions, though? The time has come for some mediation, hasn't there? And that's exactly what the UN's trying to do, getting a balanced reaction, balanced part played from both sides there in Syria.
I think one of the problems with the Annan peace plan from the start is that it's fetishised peace over really trying to allow the Syrian people to resolve the issue. In many ways, in the UN coming in this way, it's distorted the conflict. It's bottled up a lot of tensions that, often do have to try and resolve themselves in some quite unpleasant ways sometimes. It is, unfortunately, as we've seen in the Arab Spring last year, only through struggle of the people in those countries that can really bring about lasting change and the necessary battle of ideas about how Syrian society could take place. You can't always just sit all the parties round a table. In particular, you can't in Syria, because it's very hard to know exactly what constitutes the opposition, and it's a very fragmented opposition. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to exactly pin down what happened with these explosions and who's responsible for them. It's what we are seeing here is a very messy, increasingly complicated kind of civil war, and unfortunately the Annan plan is distorting that rather than actually, I think, making things better.
Also, the US is saying that Al-Qaeda militants are operating in Syria. Obviously, the US has been stirring up anti-Assad sentiment, saying that they would like to see a regime change there. Do you think, in fact, Washington's actually playing in the hands of Al-Qaeda with this?
Well, in some ways they are. I mean, Al-Qaeda hasn't had a history really of terrorist attacks in Syria. I think America likes to use the kind of the bogeyman or the spectre of Al-Qaeda to its own interest to a certain extent, and to kind of play that up. Whether or not that is the case in this situation, it's a little bit harder to tell. Certainly, there's a tendency from Assad, which you can understand, to now cast these situations as very much terrorist attacks rather than an organised body of individuals that are trying to fight in a civil war or for democracy and freedom in Syria. But it's as I said, it's very hard to understand exactly who this opposition is, exactly who brought about these attacks. The blame game is going on at the moment. There's a lot of fingers being pointed, and I think actually, in many ways, the response is about who is likely to be to blame for this. Whether or not it's Assad's forces, as some people have suggested, whether or not it's Al-Qaeda, whether or not it's a breakout group from the Free Syrian Army, tends to say more about the people commenting on the issue than it necessarily does about the situation on the ground.
You said earlier this is a matter. You said earlier this is a matter for the Syrians to sort out, and there's no excuse for this sort of foreign intervention we're seeing at the moment. But we are seeing, are we not, a humanitarian crisis unfolding very similar to what we saw in Libya, and that, of course, prompted that NATO-led intervention. Why aren't we seeing the same now, based on that humanitarian reason?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why it certainly shouldn't be the case is that Libya is no better off now than it was under Gaddafi. What you've effectively got in Libya now is a vacuum with a cherry-picked government by the West, and Libya's splintering off into city-states. They're no closer towards being able to determine their own futures and really have a free society in Libya than they did, a year or so ago. And I think, people know that Syria is a much larger country. There's much more kind of warring factions. It could become internationalised far more than Libya. And, you know, trying to have a NATO intervention in there will be very messy. I think that's why there's a lot of faith being placed in the in Kofi Annan's plan, even though from the outset it was very much seen to be, you know, just a pragmatic attempt of what else can we do. I mean, as Annan said from the start, if we take the peace plan off the table, what else could we replace it with?
Just
from
briefly,
the start, it's always...
OK, just briefly, Assad, he's introduced reforms, he's managed to stay on in power so far. How do you assess his position? Could he actually survive all of this and remain at the helm?
I think one of the things, now we have the monitors on the ground, the UN monitors on the ground in Syria. Effectively, they are getting much better at building up effectively a dossier of information about what Assad is doing. I think that could, at some point down the line, lead to greater excuses for intervention.
But Patrick, only 300 observers at the moment, only 300, not all of them there, meant to be deployed by the end of the month. 300, that's too little too late, isn't it? Just briefly.
No, it's 300 too many. I don't think that the UN observers should be meddling in the business of Syria whatsoever. So no, I disagree with that point. I think in terms of the future of Assad, what these peace plans are doing, in fetishising peace over a resolution of the conflict, they are effectively saying, you know, we need stability, even if it means Assad can remain in power. And I think that's deeply problematic.
Patrick Hayes, thanks very much indeed for your thoughts. Reporter for online British magazine Spite, live in London. Thanks for your time.